What do the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence indicate to you about what the Founding Fathers believed about God, man, justice, rights, and law? Let's just bullet point up some ideas that you pick up from those two paragraphs. Go ahead, Daniel.
It seems like they are following the fact that God integrated a form of justice in our minds. It says the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, and that's what influences us. I think that's what they're talking about.
Okay, so you're saying this is God's outworking where we live in the course of human events. Okay, all right. What else do you pick up? Nolan.
When they say long training of abuses and usurpations, they take into account for the fallenness of man, and they say wait till you find a pattern in flawed laws or flawed rulers before you take action.
All right. So you're saying they have a certain humility about their own opinions.
Yes.
That they could be wrong, and they understand that they're limited in their own understanding, and maybe even sinful and selfish. And so they're waiting for trends and patterns, a long train of, okay, all right, good. So they talk about rights, and they use the word unalienable. Now, what does that mean? Unalienable rights.
It's almost like there's certain rights, like you have to have them. It's not an option, sort of. And I think that kind of follows with what Daniel was saying, where it says they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, certain kind of that diagram where you have God at the top, and then these rights are coming down from Him, like you need them, like they're ingrained in human nature.
Okay, so they come from God.
Yes.
So they're not alienable.
Right.
Who would try to separate us from our rights that God gives us? Whom did they accuse of trying to separate them from their God-given rights?
The government.
Yeah, which government?
The British.
The British government in that case. So it's possible that certain laws might depart from God's justice and the rights that He's given to man, and when they do, when a government does that and makes certain laws that depart from God's standards, what do they say here should happen?
They say it's the right and the duty of the people to dissolve their bonds with that government and to create a government that they think is more just towards the people.
Okay. So they're trying then, they have to alter or abolish, they said here, that form of government to try to recapture the justice that God had built into human society and nature and recapture their rights.
It's almost like instead of having just a line, they have a circle where they have the government, the law, and man, and it's kind of like a curve where government is on top, and then the positive law, and then man, but then man also holds the government accountable as well, because if the government fails to do its job and help and uphold the rights of man, then the man has to take over and reestablish a better government.
Okay, now, so they do recognize God, but they say that governments derive their just powers from where?
Consent of the governed.
The consent of the governed. So the people are supposed to be vigilant to make sure their government does serve its God-intended purpose, which is to protect their unalienable rights. So it is all in a very nice, tight circle in that sense, isn't it? Danielle?
But if they're saying in here that if the government starts abusing it, that we should just throw off the government, doesn't the Bible say that we shouldn't do that in Romans 13?
Thank you very much. Triple A card for that. Romans 13. Everybody take your Bibles and turn to Romans 13.
Verse 2, therefore whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment.
So if we rebel against the governing authority, we're rebelling against what God has instituted. So how did these colonists justify what they were about to do? Michael?
Well, it wasn't just law. It seemed abusive. So, I mean, it wasn't particularly just. And I think Romans 2 is saying that if you overthrow just law, then you will be punished. But if you overthrow corrupt law, then there's no problem with it.
Oh, really? So you can overthrow corrupt law. What does this same chapter, Romans 13, say about the authorities? The authorities that exist have been established by God, verse 1. He who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves, verse 2. And verse 4, for he, the ruling authority, is God's servant to do you good. So Michael, you're saying if the governing authority stops being God's servant,
Then you can overthrow it.
then you have the right, you have the duty to alter or abolish it. And you think that's the
I
justification?
think that's what they
for
did
using-
in the revolution.
Okay, so does it ever happen that a certain government stops serving God in the world?
Definitely.
Do you have any biblical examples of that, where civil disobedience or even rebellion took place when people disobey the government? Isla.
In 2 Chronicles 23, we talked about it in history class last year. I think it's Jehoiada is his name or something like that. And he was dethroned by the people because he had failed to uphold just law. Something to that effect.
Okay,
Let's see.
all right. And so Romans 13 depicts the government as God's servants, right? But there are times when the government becomes God's enemy. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And so, Michael, would you say obedience to tyrants is disobedience to God?
I think so.
You'd be in good company. There were colonists who said that too. All right. Nathan.
Also, I think the confusion comes from verse 1 when it says there is no authority except from God. A lot of people, well, like the British and other governments in history, have thought that since they were the authority, the authority was from God no matter what they did. But because that's what it sounds like. But if you use other, like now the Jehoiada guy, he is an example of someone not following God's laws. So that verse must be more talking about authority should be from God, or like it's given from God, but it should also follow God's commandments, and it can be taken away from God. Not saying that all authority is righteous.
Okay.
Which is what the British were thinking.
All right. So authority on earth that's delegated from God for the good of human society, the consent of the governed, is not absolute. It's conditional. A government has authority as long as it is God's servant. When it becomes God's enemy, it loses its authority over the people. And who are the judges of that? The consent of whom? The governed.